You've heard of the great ones: Washington, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt for many, Ronald Reagan for, well, most of this audience, at least, I hope. And you've heard of the terrible ones: LBJ, Andrew Johnson, James Buchanan, for many, Herbert Hoover. But there are so many presidents that are just forgotten by history. We forget the circumstances that shaped them, the moments they dealt with, and the ways in which they reshaped America for better or occasionally for worse. On this historically retrospective episode, I will go back over history, looking at the 5 most underrated presidents in terms of their significance for America and the American experiment. Sometimes the times make the president, and sometimes presidents reshape the times. This episode will, I hope, give us a little bit more of a picture of how the presidency is shaped by and shapes our politics in the United States. I'm Dr. Nolte, and this is Blind Politics. And welcome, podcast listeners, to another episode of Blind Politics with Dr. Nolte. I am Dr. A.J. Nolte, Assistant Professor of Government at Regent University's Robertson School of Government. Please remember that you can rate and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast provider. We also want to thank all of those who are watching this on American One. And if you're not watching us on American One, please do so. You can find us at American One on the App Store and through all of the platforms where fine podcasts are streamed. You can also find us through the Blind Politics with Dr. Nolte YouTube channel. And once again, views expressed in this podcast do not represent those of either Regent University or the Robertson School. I wanted to take the opportunity in this episode to talk a little bit about presidents, and not necessarily some of the more famous presidents that you would know from history, but presidents who are important but forgotten. Presidents that are sometimes ranked in the middle by presidential historians. Not some of the greats and not some of the worst. I want to make the argument for at least a couple of them that they should be ranked higher, and for one of them that he should be ranked significantly lower than he often is in historical memory. Now, there have been 46 men that have held the office of President of the United States. And I would suspect that for most of my well-educated listeners and watchers today, off the top of your head, you can probably name about 10. If you can name about 10, you're probably doing pretty well. And I suspect that there is a big gap. Everybody can probably get Washington, Adams, Jefferson. Maybe if you're really paying attention, you can get Madison and Monroe or Quincy Adams, maybe an Andrew Jackson. And then you probably jump and you get Lincoln. You'd remember that Ulysses S. Grant was president because he was a famous Civil War general. You might remember James A. Garfield for being assassinated. Teddy Roosevelt, of course. And then there would probably be something about maybe a Woodrow Wilson if you're really plugged in and you've listened to any of the many conservative media sources in which Woodrow Wilson is justifiably a figure who is disliked by conservatives. But then there'd be another jump. You'd know FDR, and then from FDR on, you might know many, if not all, of the presidents who came after. You would certainly know Nixon, Reagan, and then some of the presidents that are more contemporary in our time period. What I want to do is, working backwards in time, talk about 5 presidents whose accomplishments are often forgotten in modern day history. Our first underrated president is Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower might be one of the presidents that you would know, but you probably don't necessarily know as much about his presidential term as you do about the other great accomplishment of his life, his role as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, launching the D-Day invasion, the Battle of the Bulge, and eventually the victory over the Germans in the European theater. Ike was, of course, a well-known and beloved figure by the time that he ascended to the presidency in 1952. And his presidency is sort of seen as an interlude that wasn't super consequential between the New Deal and the tumult of the 60s. When people think about the 50s, they don't necessarily think about the man who was president for most of the 50s, Dwight David Eisenhower. But discerning listeners of Blind Politics with Dr. Nolte, those who have been with us since before we had this exciting opportunity with American One, may remember that this is not the first time that Dwight David Eisenhower has been mentioned in this podcast. If you're new to us, go back and listen to the podcast I talked about where maybe it's time for Republicans to like Ike again. In many ways, Eisenhower represents the last of a line of old-school Republican presidents. Not quite Rockefeller Republicans, but in the mold of their 19th and early 20th century predecessors. He was a supporter of business, but not necessarily a limited or small government figure. In fact, he oversaw the creation of the interstate highway system, one of the most unsung but significant impacts that any president has had in the later 20th century. Eisenhower also oversaw a compromise on immigration that saw both a robust, successful guest worker program and strict enforcement of the border. This policy mix led to net zero immigration, illegal immigration, throughout the 1950s. Oddly enough, this policy mix is still supported by something like 60% of the American people and neither of the two major political parties. Ike showed us that that can work. At the same time, Eisenhower was a Republican who was very effective at courting the Hispanic vote. He ran one of the first explicit Hispanic outreach campaigns of any Republican, the Me Gusta Ike campaign in 1956, and did reasonably well in that effort. And of course, Eisenhower was also a significant player in terms of civil rights. Brown versus Board of Education, of course, happened under his watch. Other steps toward desegregation, and a significant completion of the work that was started in terms of breaking down the institutional support for segregation under his predecessors. Eisenhower, then, is a figure whose presidency marks some quiet but significant accomplishments. One of the things that I think is the most interesting about Eisenhower comes in the foreign policy sphere, with his handling of the Suez Crisis. This is the last time in which the United States would make a deliberate decision to back one of the Arab powers against Israel, backing Nasser against the Israelis and their allies at the time, the British and the French. This is ironic for anybody who's been following Middle East politics recently, but there you have it. Anyway, Eisenhower played a substantial role, and his foreign policy establishment and State Department played a substantial role in backing Nasser. Nasser would soon after respond by attempting to overthrow the government of Lebanon. And this demonstrated to Ike that the Arab nationalists could not be trusted. The unshakable character of the U.S.-Israel alliance dates back to the Suez Crisis. Before that point, there was no guarantee that the U.S. was going to be the staunch ally of Israel that it became over time. But as the Cold War advanced and Arab nationalists began to be pulled more and more into the Soviet sphere, the U.S. began to realize that Israel was not just something that was important for Jewish diaspora or Baptists and other evangelicals, but actually was important to the Cold War security architecture in the Middle East. That transition happened during the Eisenhower administration. All in all, Ike is underrated in terms of his significance. Whether you agree or disagree with everything he did, he was a much more important figure than many historians of the 20th century have credited. The same can also be said of his immediate predecessor, Harry S. Truman. Now, Truman is a little bit of a stretch for this exercise, because Truman has really gotten his due from more people as time has gone on. But Truman represents a certain type of Democrat, a type of Democrat that would dominate the party from 1945 until the ill-fated Democratic Convention of 1968 and the subsequent pivot under McGovern toward a more left-wing Democratic Party. So let's break this down. Truman was certainly economically fairly left-leaning. He was a big supporter of unions and high income taxes and things like that. Economically, he's something of a populist. Socially, he is fairly conservative, but with a catch. Certainly, he would have no place whatsoever in the Democratic Party of today, with its emphasis on transgender ideology, critical race theory, and so on and so forth. Truman was an old-school, hard-shell Baptist from the South who was very conservative on social issues. He had no inkling whatsoever that communists could or should be trusted. In this way, he was a major improvement over his predecessor as FDR's VP, George Wallace, who was about as close to a communist fellow traveler as you can get in that position. It was a very good thing that FDR replaced Wallace with Truman as his vice president before he passed away. At the same time, Truman was something of an integrationist. In fact, it's under Truman that we saw the desegregation of the U.S. military, one of the most important but unsung steps in the history of desegregation and civil rights in the United States. The military was not only before the schools, it was before the Civil Rights Act, and by a significant margin, and that was something that Truman supported. Of course, Truman also helped build the architecture of the Cold War with the containment strategy, the Truman Doctrine, and a stiff upper lip against communism. And who could possibly forget, Truman was the man who decisively ended World War II by dropping 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an important figure. What's more, Harry Truman arguably saved the Democratic Party from its conflicting worst impulses in 1948. When he went into the convention, he had 2 challengers. Strom Thurmond, who was at the time a segregationist Democrat before later becoming a Republican and subsequently, and somewhat ironically, a champion of civil rights in his later career. And Henry Wallace. I may have said George Wallace earlier. The 2 Wallaces are easy to confuse, but they're different. Henry Wallace was the vice president. George Wallace was the segregationist governor of Alabama. Both were Democrats. They were on sort of different wings of the party. So it was Henry Wallace that Truman replaced. And it was Henry Wallace that he also ran against in 1948. Truman managed to not only win the convention, but also, in an upset, defeat his Republican opponent. And so he preserved the DNA of the Democratic Party as a party that was going to be both anti-communist and pro-civil rights, at least to some degree. And this DNA would again hold until 1968. Moving backward in time, we have a bit of a jump after Eisenhower and Truman. Everybody knows FDR, and I don't particularly want to delve into the Herbert Hoover, Calvin Coolidge, Warren G. Harding end of things for a while. Going back a little bit further, we could talk about William McKinley, but there's not a lot to talk about there. And while Grover Cleveland is interesting, I don't know that he had as much of an impact as the next guy we're going to talk about. The great, the unsung, Chester Arthur. How many of you even knew that that was the name of someone who was a president of the United States? Well, let's flash back. The year was 1880, and the Republican Party at the time pretty much dominated the country outside of the recently, and by recently I mean like 1875, reconstructed South. But there was a problem. Republicans were divided between several different factions of the party, and the issue that was dividing them the most was the issue of civil service reform. Up to this point, basically every job in the government was appointed via what was called the spoils system. In other words, you got appointed to a job in the government based on who you knew and which party machine you'd worked for, not necessarily based on any qualification you might or might not have. Most corrupt of all the spoils party machines at this time was the New York Republican political machine of party boss Roscoe Conkling. And Conkling in 1880 was pushing for a 3rd term of his friend Ulysses S. Grant. But Grant was still remembered as a figure who was full of scandals. And so Grant was not favored by a lot of people at the convention. James Garfield emerged as a dark horse. He was what was called a half-breed, someone who was seen as sympathetic to civil service reform, but not necessarily on bad terms with all the stalwart factions. But in order to get the support of the Conkling machine, Garfield offered to choose whoever Conkling wanted as his vice president. It's not exactly clear how this happened, but the man that they eventually chose was Chester Arthur, the New York Port Authority Commissioner, and arguably one of the most blatant beneficiaries of the spoils system. Arthur was known for using his position as Port Authority Commissioner to mostly do party work, and there were many people in his office who were seen as fairly corrupt. In fact, he'd been investigated by the previous Congress for his spoilsmanship, as it was then called. And while he had promised a certain amount of reform in his office, most real supporters of spoils thought it was too little too late. Arthur took the job and then, well, didn't do much for a while. After all, Garfield had picked someone from a different faction of the party, and he was interested in putting his people in positions of power and authority. Until an absolute lunatic who thought himself to be receiving a message from the Lord and also had been snubbed for jobs by Garfield, named Charles Guiteau, shot Garfield because at the time there was no such thing as a Secret Service. By the way, this resulted in the Secret Service, which previously was investigating things like Treasury scandals, now taking over responsibility for protecting the president. So when I say there was no such thing as a Secret Service, it did exist, but its primary job was assigned after Garfield got shot. Unfortunately for poor Garfield, this was too little too late, and now Chester Arthur was president. As Guiteau said, "I am a stalwart, a supporter of the spoil system, and Arthur is president now." But Chester Arthur would eventually shock everyone by signing the most ambitious civil service reform to that point in the history of America, the Pendleton Act, which created the merit-based civil service. Now, some of us might say, this isn't necessarily as good of a thing as you might think, given how much the civil service has morphed into the bloated leviathan of the administrative state. But we have to keep in mind that the things that can cause solutions, or the solutions of problems, I'm going to record that. Now, some of us may not look favorably on this development of a merit-based civil service because of the leviathan the administrative state has become today. However, it's worth keeping in mind that the solutions of yesterday can cause the problems of today or tomorrow. And it's hard to argue that the Pendleton Act wasn't necessary at the time. We should also keep in mind that it wasn't the Pendleton Act that necessarily led to the immediate growth of government, but the Progressive Era, which came a little bit later. And it's worth remembering the story of Chester Arthur, a man who benefited from a system, but who, when in office, grew in office, and actually became someone who lived up to the expectations of that office and did what was right for the country. This is also true of another man that we recently discussed, a man who worked his way up through the John Prendergast machine of Kansas City, Missouri, before eventually becoming president, Harry Truman. If Chester Arthur is the unsung hero of American history, Millard Fillmore is one of its unsung villains. And this pains me to say because Fillmore is from not far from Buffalo, New York, which is an area that I have some association with, having grown up in that area. But unfortunately, Millard Fillmore was a horrible president. Like Chester Arthur, Fillmore came into power because his predecessor died. Now, Zachary Taylor was not assassinated, he just died in office. And Fillmore came into power when the Whigs were in office. The Whigs were a political party that wanted to build internal improvements, and basically they're the predecessors of the sort of pro-business, pro-infrastructure Republicans that we discussed with Eisenhower. Millard Fillmore really wanted to get some tariffs passed and really wanted to get some infrastructure built. But there was a problem. He needed support from the South. And so, in order to try to solve the slavery issue, he supported what would be known as the Compromise of 1852. Unfortunately, the Compromise of 1852 is also one of the proximate causes of the Civil War. In addition to changing the formula of admitting one free state and one slave state at the same time, and instituting a referendum system for Kansas and Nebraska that would lead to, as you might expect, civil war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers in Kansas. It also passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which essentially deputized free states, whether they wanted to or not, to serve as slave hunters of the slave states. This is why it's so ironic that shortly After this, the southern states would use the battle cry of states' rights, when in reality they had violated the rights of the northern states, many of whom had laws against returning runaways. In other words, they were for the use of federal law to override state laws when that federal law was protecting the peculiar institution, but not when it might not do so. Millard Fillmore then had an even more ignominious end to his political career. In 1856, he tried to run to get his old job back. And unfortunately, he did not decide to run on the platform of the new Republican Party. That was John C. Fremont with his free soil, free labor, free men, Fremont slogan. No, Millard Fillmore ran on the party, the American Party, also known as the Know Nothings, a party that instead of fighting against slavery, wanted to try to close down all immigration to the country. Many of those immigrants, by the way, would end up then serving in the Union Army during the Civil War 4 years later. So this would probably not have been a particularly good idea. All in all, Millard Fillmore is a disreputable figure, and the compromise that he oversaw almost certainly led directly to the American Civil War. The last of my 5 presidential figures is an interesting one and an important one, albeit hard to say whether you like or don't like him, and it really depends on your perspective. I refer, of course, to somebody else that you probably never heard of, James K. Polk. The 1846 Democratic Presidential Convention was a fairly contentious affair, and not many people knew who James K. Polk was before he emerged as president, so don't feel bad that you don't either. But his campaign slogan was 54-40 or fight. Polk was a big believer in manifest destiny, the expansion of the United States to take over the entirety of the North American continent. In that capacity, Polk supported not only the annexation of Texas, but as much other territory as possible. And so after a border dispute between Mexicans and the United States, once Polk's annexation of Texas was approved, the United States would declare war on Mexico, a war that would lead to the annexation of Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and of course, California. This is a big chunk of territory to be added to the United States. And while it's not quite the last territorial expansion, it does complete that westward expansion of the United States. And it brings California into the country, something that would be hugely significant as gold was discovered there not long after. James K. Polk was in many other ways a fairly unremarkable Democrat. His presidency was largely taken up with this foreign policy issue, and it would also prove contentious, as many Northerners opposed the expansion of the United States because they saw it as merely an attempt by pro-slavery forces to spread slavery and bring new slave states into the Union. Even here, the issue of slavery was simmering under the surface. But James K. Polk is significant, especially if you live in the Southwest, in that his presidency added a lot of territory to the new and rapidly growing country. Well, that is my list of 5 presidents. There are a number of others that I considered. Some of the also-rans include James Monroe, a person who was another sort of political hack who made good. Though he was a vicious political infighter supporting the Madison and Jefferson political machine, he would subsequently oversee the era of good feelings, the only time period in American history where there were no political parties, including the Washington administration. I might have also mentioned Grant himself, who had an interesting and somewhat colorful presidency that's overlooked. And of course, there is the favorite of libertarian-leaning conservatives everywhere, Calvin Coolidge. But really, Calvin Coolidge's claim to fame is that he didn't do much as president, so it's kind of hard to put him on a list of presidents who are underestimated for the significant things they did. Still, if you're more libertarian-leaning, Silent Cal's lack of action might be something that you would admire. That's going to be a wrap for this episode. Please remember that you can rate and subscribe on your favorite podcast provider, or you can find us on American One. I do hope that you all have enjoyed this episode, and we'll come back for more episodes of Blind Politics. And so for Blind Politics, this is Dr. Nolte signing off.